Hello lovely people, my name is Emma, welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to regale you with some of the weirdness of British tradition, and also talk about a couple of important things. Tuesday this week we had the Queen's yearly speech, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to cover a little bit of politics, touch on a little bit of religion, and we're going to take a look at some of the weird gaudy traditionalism in British politics, so there's really something for everyone. I'm going to break this down into sections so you can skip to the parts that you're interested in, but without further ado, let's take a look at what the Queen's speech actually involves. First things first, lots of people standing and waiting around in excitement and anticipation for the Queen. Guy plays a trumpet. The first and most important character to appear on the scene is the Imperial State Crown. Very, very flashy, shiny, jewelled hat, which thankfully the poor Queen doesn't have to wear on this occasion. It just comes in on a cushion on its own. Immediately behind the crown, we have the lady herself, a sweet 95-year-old lady tottering along, holding her handbag, looking like the nation's grandma. We parade her through into the House of Lords, where everybody stands up. She hurries up some steps, looking perfectly normal until the point where she gets to the gilded golden arena and sits herself down on a giant throne, which is for me when things start to get weird. She calls everyone to be seated and sends out a special signal. The signal is passed to a member called Black Rod, also known as Lady Usher of the Black Rod, which is kind of an awesome title, but I still think they should consider like Guardian of the Stick or something like that. Black Rod heads to the Commons chamber, where MPs are waiting to be summoned to hear the Queen's speech. The door of the House is ceremonially slammed in her face. No, I'm not joking, that is what happens. It symbolises the Commons' independence. She bangs on the door 3 times with the stick in the stick banging zone. I kind of wonder if we'll ever reach a point where the stick just goes through from the wood being so perished from being banged all the time. That would be kind of amazing. I would live to see that happen. And then there's a little bit more ceremonial bowing, and then finally the Queen's speech can actually begin. She reads from a prepared speech, and this is where we get into what the Queen's speech actually is and why, despite all the ridiculousness around the ceremony, it is actually quite important. This speech opens every new parliamentary session. What the Queen's speech does is outline in the most general way what is upcoming in the next parliamentary session, parliamentary sessions each lasting a year. She sets out all the government policies and proposed legislature for the entire year, which is why it's quite important. This year was an interesting one because, of course, the main focus was moving forward out of the pandemic and economic and job recovery and things like that, so a lot of it is quite standard and to be expected. There are a couple of notes, obviously, that interested me and a lot of people, which is what I'm going to talk about today. One of the propositions this year is mandatory voter ID, which is something that, on the surface, sounds like common sense. It sounds like it makes perfect sense. You show ID to prove you are who you say you are, and then you vote. I can understand why it seems sensible, and to an outsider, people may be asking, why is everybody kicking up such a fuss? I will tell you. The first, and I think probably most major consideration here, is that we don't have a problem with electoral fraud. My assumption is that this was a knee-jerk reaction to the accusations made in the US elections this year. That's the only thing that I can really think of this past year, because it's weird. It's like it's like a grown-up version of the school year. You have the school year and then you've got like the parliamentary year and the tax year. So voter fraud is just not something that the UK has a problem with. It's already a very safe practice. I've got statistics here from The Guardian. In 2019, there were 595 alleged cases of electoral fraud investigated by the police. Only 33 related to voter impersonation at a polling station, which is 0.0000057% of the votes cast in the elections that took place that year. So there is a complete absence of voter impersonation that would require this kind of bill. So on the face of it, it seemingly comes from nowhere. So requiring photo ID. 3.5 million people in the UK don't have access to a photo ID. 11 million don't have a passport or driver's license. In most countries where you require an ID to vote, the ID is already mandatory, or there's a low fee or no cost ID version, which there isn't in the UK. So everyone who requires an ID already has to have one, whereas in the UK that's not the case. Because getting photo ID is a complicated and expensive practice, the people that this kind of bill is going to affect are the people who are already marginalised. ID laws disproportionately affect people from lower income and marginalised communities, elderly people, the homeless. I'm going to steal a quote from The Guardian because I think they put this really well. This policy is a solution in search of a problem. Voting is safe and secure in the UK. Our own government keeps assuring us of that. Repeatedly, we are talking about how proud we are of having such a safe and secure voting system. So there's no evidence for any actual need for voter ID, but there are many, many potential pitfalls. One, It's expensive to do. We don't have any money. We've just been through a very expensive pandemic. There isn't a problem here at the moment that we actually need to solve. So we're going to be spending an estimated £20 million per election on something we don't need. As well as making things harder for specific groups, it's going to put people off in a variety of other ways because the process will take much longer. There's likely to be queues that we don't currently have to worry about. The poll workers and administrators will have a whole new world of confusion to deal with because it will be their place to judge whether or not someone is legitimate. And you know, I've had my ID turned down in the supermarket because it's an old photo and I don't have my glasses in it. Legitimate voters could be turned away because they've grown facial hair or their face shape has changed in such a way that they don't look like their photo anymore, and suddenly you're taking legitimate votes away from people who even do have ID. It's an endless pit of these problems. I'm again in agreement with the Guardian article on this point they make, which is that when it comes to fraudulent behaviour around elections, it's really the political parties that are causing the most damage and need to be kept under control. Let's not even get into the Brexit buses and the huge amount of misinformation that fueled the massive devastating vote that is causing us to currently withdraw from the EU. There are so many problems with the current electoral system that are not this, that putting this kind of money and effort into voter ID is just absurd. It's absurd. I think if the last year has highlighted anything for me to do with our government, it's that they are very adept at pushing agendas that make the British public the enemy of itself, and subsequently avoiding pointing the finger back at our own government that's supposed to be responsible for legislature. So that's mandatory voter ID. We'll see what happens. The second topic of discussion from the Queen's speech, and that will be featured in this parliamentary session, is the ban of conversion therapy, which is the sort of thing where you see the headline and you're like, it's not banned yet? It's really not banned yet? It's one of those things that if you're not paying attention, you just assume it must have already happened, because we're not so backwards and outdated, are we? Our outdated laws are funny things, like no walking cows down the street in daylight. And the classic and my all-time favourite, which I've mentioned before, it's illegal to handle a salmon in suspicious circumstances. These are fun, silly things that stay in our legal system because they don't matter, and we look at them and go, ha 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 ha. Conversion therapy is the sort of thing you assume is so backwards and outdated that it must have been already banned. Alas. So the good news is, a ban is coming. The Queen confirmed it in her speech. A small and understandable amount of concern is coming from the fact that this is going to be preceded by consultation. The obvious surface question being, what consultation do we need? Just do it. It's bad, we want to get rid of it, finally get rid of it please. What are the possible ins and outs that we need to discuss? Blanket ban conversion therapy, problem solved. But no, there are aspects that apparently need to be considered, such as religious freedoms and how to protect accredited professionals. First of all, I don't care about protecting people who practice conversion therapy. They think I'm going to hell. As far as I'm concerned, they can do the same, but they can do it right now. The more broad, wibbly, difficult side of it is the religious freedom side of it, which is the sort of broad phrasing that makes governments crumble, because you've got to protect religious freedoms. Now, the freedom to practice your religion, live how you want without hurting others, 100%. Absolutely. We don't have a separation of church and state in this country. Technically, our religion is the Church of England. We get given little books of psalms in schools. My school had a big statue of Jesus on it. It's something that many of our prime ministers and MPs in general like to keep drawing back to and talking about how great our traditions are and how we're a Christian country and that's just one of the things that makes us brilliant. That sort of thing makes me cringe because I disagree and I don't like it, but it doesn't massively affect my life. So I can kind of let it go. When it comes to conversion therapy, no, we've agreed that it's harmful. Health professionals have been saying for a really long time this is an extremely dangerous practice. No one should have to go through it, regardless of religion or otherwise. It should be a blanket ban. You have to consider people on both ends of the age spectrum. The very young who were brought up in religious households and are too young to decide things for themselves. Their parents might push them into certain things or have particular beliefs that affect how they treat their child. The same going for the elderly. People can also make these choices based on a lifetime of indoctrination that maybe they would come out of and feel regret. The stories from people who have gone through conversion therapy are absolute horror stories. It's awful. It is so extremely damaging to people. And you cannot change the nature of a person. You cannot force a person to change. You can only force a person to deny themselves and live deeply unhappily with guilt and sadness. So this is the statement from the government on the matter. They'll be asking the public and interested parties how best to address the problem while still protecting the medical profession, defending freedom of speech, and upholding religious freedom. So, okay, here's a random example. You cannot beat children in Catholic school here. There are plenty of places in the world that would say that is a religious freedom that's being broken. Irregardless, we don't want to hurt children, so we have the law in place anyway. The law should apply to conversion therapy in the same way. The government also said it wants legitimate forms of pastoral support to be allowed to continue, including prayer to help someone explore their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, if you're talking about conversion therapy, exploring and understanding your sexuality or gender identity would not apply. Peter Lyons, who is the director of the Evangelical Alliance, which represents 3,500 churches, he's very happy about the consultation process and said this: "We want to avoid the situation where a person can be accused of conversion therapy for praying with someone who freely chooses and asks for prayer." Now, what exactly are they asking for? Someone who asks for prayer to reach out to God on helping them understand their journey of self-discovery? That wouldn't be conversion therapy. Those people wouldn't be at risk. The only time a person would be accused of conversion therapy is if they are praying together to convert the person's gender or sexuality. That's the only way it can happen, and then it would be conversion therapy, and it should be banned. They should be accused of it because it's what they're doing. There's like two angles I want to discuss here, right? So I want to first approach from a logical perspective that might offend some. When it comes to making really disgusting, harmful practices illegal, I kind of don't care. Which is that prayer doesn't work. Prayer doesn't work. Prayer demonstrably doesn't work because... You see what I'm saying? There have been multiple studies into intercessory prayer which prove that the best you can do is the placebo effect. Sometimes it demonstrates negative effects, and when people don't know they're being prayed for, there is no effect, or the effect is in line with coincidence. To think that God is interfering in your life to make you safe when you drive to work, but is happy to ignore the prayers of a whole community wiped out by a tsunami, say, how egocentric do you have to be? So prayer doesn't work. There was a survey in 2018 asking people if they had gone through conversion therapy or been offered some form of conversion therapy. More than half who went through conversion therapy said it was conducted by a faith group. Therefore, it is just as important to eliminate conversion therapy from faith-based practices as it is overall. So logical side, prayer doesn't work. Emotional side, there is no way to know how much people are being coerced, especially when it is faith-based. The amount of guilt that is used to push people into doing things that could seriously damage them. If you have family, friends, loved ones, your entire community sometimes putting the same pressure on you to do something, can you be said to be freely making that decision? My hope is that the conversation around this will be brief and decisive. I would hope that if the public is consulted, I would hope that if the public's opinion is taken into account, then people like the Evangelical Alliance will form a much smaller percentage of the overall viewpoint and will be able to listen to healthcare professionals, the Royal College of Psychologists, who are taking part to highlight the harmful effects of conversion therapy, Stonewall. My hope is that it's taken seriously enough that we don't put measures in place to basically protect the people that were already doing it from being legally exempt from this law. And I hope it happens quickly. Like I said, it's astounding that it's still legal in the first place, and depressing. Fingers crossed it's not going to be long. That is a little bit of British politics for you. That's what's coming up in the next parliamentary session. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts on voter ID and conversion therapy. If you've never seen one of the Queen's speeches before, let me know what you think about the whole ceremony around it, because I'm an English person and I think it's hilarious and strange. And let me just give a quick shout out to my giant chickens over on Patreon: Amber, blacknoisyblue the blue minipxl, ChicFilADeathFries, and Connla, Chicken Maximus, Lyons. Goddammit, Connla. Thank you so much for watching. Do drop your comments down below. Check out my social medias. I'm doing things and whatnots and stuff. Most importantly, have a lovely week, and I will see you very soon.